A little more than 20 years ago, I sat in a classroom with Buddhist environmental philosopher Joanna Macy. This was long before Starr King School for the Ministry moved to Oakland, and long before I returned to Starr King to serve as a professor at the institution which helped shape me into the kind of faithful person I suspected I might want to be. What I remember most about that afternoon was a real fear of looking foolish, of my own audacity, of taking on the trappings of a kind of knowing I knew I had no business pretending to. I found myself sitting cross-legged on a carpet, trying to imagine what eagles might have to say about the state of the world. It was my first year of seminary, and I really wanted to do well in Joanna Macy's class, because it was the first one I had entered where I recognized anything at all on the first day. I had come out of a biology program when I entered seminary, and while it felt like my classmates could easily speak the language of theology and religion, I was relieved to see a brain cell on the chalkboard that day. So here we were, it was later in the semester, and we had been in serious, challenging conversations about climate disruption and what it might mean to give all beings equal voice, about our relationship to the earth and what most needed to be done. Macy calls this exercise the Council of All Beings. Have any of you participated in this work? Yeah. So it was the Council of All Beings, but let me tell you, she was serious that it was my responsibility to give eagles voice. She writes that the Council of All Beings is a communal ritual in which participants step aside from their human identity and speak on behalf of another life form. A simple structure for spontaneous expression. It aims to heighten awareness of our interdependence with the living body of Earth and to strengthen our commitment to defend it. The ritual serves to help us acknowledge and give voice to the suffering of the world, and it serves in equal measure to help us experience the beauty and power of our interconnectedness with all of life. Doesn't that sound beautiful? Accountable, even? The problem for me was that sitting cross-legged on the carpet at Starr King, all I could think of was DDT and the loss of eagles' habitats. I kept seeing the eagle on the US presidential seal in my mind, and I couldn't imagine what I might possibly have to say in the voice of an eagle as we discussed what must be done in the face of a kind of earthly struggle and environmental suffering that was caused primarily by my species, my identity that I was meant to set aside, and the extremes of which we were still learning to recognize in the world. I think about how badly I represented eagles that day. Mostly because I now live in Maryland near Washington, D.C., and I actually get to see bald eagles in my neighborhood, across the street from my house. They look a lot less presidential as juveniles, and they seem much more powerful when they feed. But it was my professor's implacable expectation that we would wrestle with what we thought we knew about being human in the world, long enough to set it aside for an hour, not to pretend to live life of another sacred being, but to listen hard enough to Earth, to her peoples and what they were saying, that we just might imagine another way of being in the world. I don't think any of us was assigned the voice of an oak tree or even a humble acorn, but I imagine the oaks coming en masse to the Council of All Beings, sometimes like the Ents in The Lord of the Rings. Do you remember those giant tree-like beings who took care of the forest and took on the characteristics, right, of trees in Tolkien's writings? Ents are slow moving. They're methodical. They think through the implications of every word that they say. Now, I might not be able to actually speak for an oak tree, but imagining their needs helps me to slow down, to reflect, even when everything around me feels urgent. Imagining a conversation that makes room for the wisdom of oaks transforms what I think I know about working for justice. There's something inherently universalist in this practice that Macy called us to. It requires that we treat all forms of life as sacred, as valuable, and it refuses to allow the kind of spiritual bypass that I was desperate for that day, in that moment where I could maybe take refuge in my inability to really know another being's mind, especially given the differences in our brain function, and especially given the lack of shared communication between us. I can't possibly set aside my human wiring, I wanted to say. To which Dr. Macy would have said, the earth is in crisis. You must. You must. Our inherited tradition insists that we cannot be a faithful people unless we hold the value and worth of every person and every being at the center of our living. The love that we claim as the heart of universalism comes from a love ethic that is generally characterized as liberal Christian practice. Our tradition insists that we are defined as a people by the choices that we make, and that at our best, connected to each other, we strive to make those choices based on compassion, care, responsibility, respect, justice, and more. Right? And so that not knowing, that worrying, that fear of looking foolish, or even the simple exhaustion of these days, even terror at times, they're not reason enough for turning away from the harms that are shaping everyday life. And I'm not here to try to tell you that every moment of every day can be about the creation of justice in the world. I feel like I want to say that everywhere I go, to organizers, teachers, caretakers, parents, everyone who is responsible for anyone in the world. Right? It's unsustainable. But neither can we turn away. Neither can we place the trappings of our tradition as replacements for what love asks of us in these times. It would be pretty easy for me. I would be comfortable as a former UU theology professor, worse, as a former preaching professor, to proclaim from the pulpit that we are a covenantal faith that is grounded in an ethic of love which calls us to powerful interconnection with one another, for all that this is true. But that everyday, honest, messy, gritty universalism that keeps me up at night whispers to me, what are you willing to risk? You who believe that every life is valuable. You who choose to lean into joy, that it might sustain you in the days when the very leaders of your nation seek to end the lives of those you hold holy. Who will you be as an envoy of love in the days yet to come? Who will we be? These troubling, transforming whispers begin to shape me, reshape me into new form. And I wonder, what has been shaping you? What is shaping you in these days? Because we keep experiencing how in state after state after state, proposed legislation is seeking to limit the full life and thriving of whole ranges of people separated out by our identities, be we transgender or BIPOC, be we capable of giving birth or simply too young to vote gun proponents out of office. Every passing day, we bear witness to atrocities that encourage us to turn away. They do, we're human. They encourage us to turn away, to deny our power, to deny our voices and the voices of others, and to act in ways that contradict the teachings of our living tradition. And beloveds, we were already tired. Were you tired before this wave? This is hard to say, but it is not an accident that we are experiencing literally acts of evil in the public square, immoral attempts at control that are coming while we are still grieving the newly dead. It is not an accident. And while we strive still to find a way to make these long COVID days as equitable and just for as many members of our beloved communities as possible. And yet, love is calling. Love is calling us to live our universalism boldly in days when that expected politeness of pretending at equality is no longer asked of our leaders in the public square. I find that frightening. But still, love shapes us into new being. The Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker, who is both a Methodist and a UU theologian, our former president at Starr King School, she wrote an essay called After the Apocalypse, which I'll be honest with you, I read because I liked the after. After the Apocalypse, that through its reflection on religious liberalism speaks powerfully to the meaning of apocalyptic times right now. But in 1995, she writes, "In our time, hope means not running away from the icy, hard ground of suffering, violence, injustice, or deceit. It means savoring the sweetness of human love. It means lighting the Sabbath candles, smelling the spices, and opening our hearts to the sources of refreshment and grace that are offered to us. Survival means reconstructing from the ruins of a world of hospitality. Survival means reconstructing from the ruins a world of hospitality and of peace. It means living as one of those who, as Adrienne Rich says, with no extraordinary power, reconstitutes the world. The question, beloveds, is how might we best become carriers of the flame of our living tradition? I think we all know not to play with fire. But Oaks would remind us that fire itself brings new life in the forest. The cremation that Rupi Kaur spoke about in our morning reading is a fire that frees, that liberates. And it represents a kind of alchemy, a transformation that lies somewhere beyond our current knowing, yet lingers as close as breath, ready to transform us to answer love's call. Parker wrote another essay called simply Love First. She means that show up and love first, where she returns us to that love ethic that we inherited from our liberal Christian forebears. She says loving our neighbor implicates us in loving the whole network of life. Science gives us photographs of the earth from space, and we can see we are one blue globe, wreathed in clouds. We know the crust of the earth floats on a core of fire. We dwell in our cities and our towns on a living, breathing planet, transformed by fire, flowing waters, the exhalation of trees, and the inbreathing of animals. And this interconnectedness of all calls for wisdom and reverence. We cannot love after the fact and expect love to save life. Maybe in the end, love will save us all, but it has a much better chance at the beginning. I think we need a council of all beings for life as we know it today, and life as we will know it tomorrow and in the days to come. Not to take agency from those who have the right to speak for their own liberation, but instead to set our individualism aside for long enough to listen to what our collective salvation requires. To set that individualism aside long enough to benefit from the wisdom of the gathered whole. Beloveds, hear me when I tell you something we don't say often in UU congregations, which is that we do, in fact, need to be saved. Not from a doctrine of original sin or the idea that there is nothing we can do to be worthy of being saved by a distant God from on high. Remember, Universalism teaches that there is nothing we can do that separates us from an all-embracing love, however we understand that love to be calling us in our living. Universalism also teaches us that we actually save one another, and that none can be saved while any remain unfree. So how might we be called to set aside what we think we've known for long enough to not only imagine new ways of being, but to catalyze the work that our liberation requires? How do we become carriers of a flame that burns with conviction and carry it anyway? A flame that strengthens us to carry forward teachings that may not, in fact, be realized in our lifetimes, but whose hopeful possibility grounds us for the journey ahead. A revealing flame whose alchemy turns our risking into our faith. If Earth itself participated in a council of beings, we might be invited to experience wisdom in geological time. I can think of no greater fire carrier than the Earth itself, and even with that thin crust of life floating atop molten flame, Earth models for us again and again that every being in the system relies on every other, and that we must attend to the whole interconnected network for the thriving of all. Beloveds, in these tenuous yet re-emergent days, let us hold tightly to a flame that burns. Let us risk showing up fully, boldly, for our values and the values that love requires. But mostly let us hold fast to one another as we face the unknown. As Dr. Rideout reminded me this week, we can dwell in hardship and still stay together in community. In fact, we must. We must. May this community be a blessing, and may the call to transform together hold us when we might otherwise lose our way. May we remember to love first, and through that love, both ordinary and extraordinary, may we reconstitute this world. Amen. Ashe. Blessed be.